Good morning. Thank you for joining me. I'm coming to you from Siloam Missionary Baptist Church located in Rougemont, North Carolina, where the Reverend Wayne Johnson is pastor. I will be bringing you the Sunday school lesson for August 20th, 2023, which is entitled God's Gracious Rewards. Lesson text comes from Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Related scriptures, Matthew chapter 19, verses 16 through 30, chapter 20, verses 20 through 28, and Luke chapter 13, verses 22 through 30. My name is Charlotte Timberlake. I'll be reading the scripture lesson text, starting with Matthew chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour, and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right I will give you. And they went their way. Again he went out about the sixth and ninth hour, and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out, and found others standing idle, and saith unto them, Why stand ye here all the day idle? They say unto him, Because no man hath hired us. He saith unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, that shall ye receive. So when even was come, the Lord of the vineyard said unto his steward, Call the laborers, and give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first. And when they came that were hired about the 11th hour, they received every man a penny. But when the first came, they supposed that they should have received more, and they likewise received every man a penny. And when they had received it, they murmured against the goodman of the house, saying, These last have wrought but 1 hour, and thou hast made them equal unto us, which have borne the burden and heat of the day. But he answered one of them, and said, Friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst not thou agree with me for a penny? Take that thine is, and go thy way. I will give unto this last even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? Is thine eye evil because I am good? So the last shall be first, and the first last. For many be called, but few chosen. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of his word. Golden text. The man said unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right I will give you. And they went their way. Matthew chapter 20, verse 4. Introducing the lesson. The parable in this week's lesson presents an interesting twist on a scenario sometimes encountered in the workplace. Developing the lesson. Number 1. Workers hired. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 2. Ripe fruit must be harvested immediately. The householder in Jesus' parable suddenly had an abundance of ripe fruit, so he recruited workers to harvest it. Number 2. More workers hired. Matthew chapter 20, verses 3 through 7. The crop of grapes must have been very good, for the householder went back to recruit more workers at 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., and 5 p.m. Number 3. The workers paid. Matthew chapter 20, verses 8 through 9. The householder had promised the later workers fair payment. Imagine how pleasantly surprised the later workers were when they received a full day's wage for just a few hours' work. This generous action illustrates God's grace. Number 4, some workers complain. Matthew chapter 20, verses 10 through 12. The first workers expected more when they saw how generous the employer had been with the latecomers. Number 5, the householder's response. Matthew chapter 20, verses 13 through 16. Verse 13 is a key to understanding the parable. The original workers had agreed to a certain amount and were satisfied to work for that amount when they were hired. The householder had lived up to his agreement with them. The later workers had not agreed to any set amount. They had simply trusted the householder to give them what was right. Their faith in the man had been generously rewarded. God's grace and sovereignty are illustrated by the statement made in Matthew chapter 20, verse 14. God is not accountable to men. Men are accountable to God. God has a right to extend his grace to whomsoever he will. In verse 15, the householder asked, "Is thine eye evil because I am good?" In what sense were the complaining workers in the wrong? They were suggesting that the householder was being unfair when he was not. God is not unjust because he exercises his sovereignty in the affairs of people. He is God. I will now go over the questions in the back of the lesson. Question number 1. Why did Jesus use parables as he described what the kingdom of heaven is like? The answer: just as a preacher will use stories to illustrate spiritual principles, so Jesus used parables to clarify what he was teaching. Question number 2. What agreement did the owner make with the first shift of workers? The answer: the man went out early in the morning to get the workers he needed to harvest his grapes. The standard wage for work like this was a penny, verse 2, or a denarius per day. The man and the laborers agreed to these terms, and he sent them into the vineyard at the beginning of the workday, which was about 6 o'clock in the morning. Question number 3. How did the agreement with the later shifts differ from that with the first shift? The answer: he found some men there who were willing to work. Instead of agreeing on a set wage for them, the man promised to give them whatever was right. Question number 4. At what times of the day did the owner recruit workers? The answer: at noon, and then again at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he went back to the marketplace to get more workers. Question number 5. How did the owner instruct the steward to pay the workers? The answer: when evening came, the owner gave his steward specific instructions about paying the laborers. The fact that they were to be paid was expected. The manner in which they were paid, beginning with those hired last, was almost certainly different from the norm. Question number 6. Why was the final shift of workers surprised at their wages? The answer: when the last shift of workers came to the steward, they were amazed at the wage they received. The owner had authorized them to get a full day's wage, a denarius. Question number 7. Why were the first workers disappointed when they received their wages? The answer: if the last shift had been surprised to get a full denarius, the first shift was stunned by receiving the same amount. The steward gave to them exactly what they had agreed to as a wage, no less and no more. although in their own minds they supposed that they would receive more than the wages they had agreed to. That was not, in fact, the case. Question number 8. Why did the first workers murmur against the owner? The answer: the earlier workers were offended that the latecomers were treated as well as they. Instead of rejoicing for the others, they insisted that those who had worked just 1 hour had no right to be compensated as the owner had determined. Question number 9. How did the owner show that their charge of injustice was not justified? The answer: apparently the owner took one of the first shift workers aside to talk with him. The charge that the workers had made against the owner was of injustice, so he began at that point. Because they had received the complete wage to which they had agreed, their charge of injustice could not be sustained. The owner had not defrauded them at all. And question number 10. How does the parable illustrate God's grace to people? The answer: this parable reminded the disciples that while there is reward for faithful service to God, they must not think about it in strictly human terms. God gives freely according to his grace. Here are the practical points from the lesson. Number 1. It is the privilege of every Christian to be sent forth to labor for the Lord. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 2. Number 2. We can be sure that our faithful service will be rewarded by the Lord. Verses 3 through 5. Number 3. Diligent, faithful service should characterize every Christian regardless of his age or circumstances. Verses 6 through 7. Number 4. God's rewards are not based on the outward superficial standards by which people often judge one another. He looks on the heart. Verses 8 through 13. Number 5. When we truly grasp the fact that all the blessings we enjoy are gifts of God's grace, there will be less place for envy. Verses 14 through 15. Number 6. It is senseless to follow the world's self-centered ways. They do not reflect the values of God. Verse 16. Summary. The main idea conveyed by Jesus' parable is that God's rewards are based solely on his grace and sovereignty, not on human standards. God's ways are not our ways. There are many things that God does that we do not understand. We should remember that God is sovereign and gracious. He is just and faithful in keeping his promises. He also is a gracious rewarder of those who put their trust in him. As Christians, it is not our place to murmur at God's judgments or to be envious of those who seem to be more blessed than ourselves. We should worship our sovereign God and trust him to always do what is right. This will conclude the lesson for this morning. Thank you for listening. God rewards the faithful who, amid their circumstances, continue to believe in his wisdom, mercy, and power instead of questioning his reasons.